where crime is sort of present amidst an aging population of people as well. So what happened in these projects, and this is really when the word housing project becomes synonymous with what we think, is you had families, but you also had lots of young men who were unemployed. They could not find work, because one of the things that happened in a lot of these cities is banks left, so there's no more capital. You understand? You can't borrow money if there's not a bank around. There weren't any car dealerships, so nobody owned cars. There were very few jobs at all. No more factories relocated to the suburbs, interestingly enough. And what happened was, we call this urban blight, B-L-I-G-H-T. And so in many housing projects, you saw what took over was local gang activity. Usually there was very little policing in these high-rise projects. Hello? Hello? Thought I heard something. So in places like Cabrini Green here, you saw a huge spike in crime. So these gangs would control floors of the housing project. They would sell drugs and on a large scale.
The unfortunate luck.
Jaden, I think your mic is on. All right, so I took care of that. So, this was a very difficult period in African-American life, because there really, you could say, like, well, go find a job. Well, there weren't any. All the jobs had pulled out. And elderly people might be on assistance, public assistance, but at the time, there weren't many other means to public assistance. And so what you began to really see was a large-scale protest of exploitive ghettos, right? Exploitative ghettos. And so I have tried to teach you guys this all year long, that owning a home or owning property is the key to much of the American dream. Yep. Owning a business, owning a house, because once you buy a house, you have what is called equity. Equity means I can borrow against my house without actually borrowing money from anything else. Like, in other words, I own the house, so I can borrow money from the value of the house. It gives me excellent credit rating, so I don't have to pay hardly any interest, and I can use it to send my kids to college, or I can sell my house and buy another house, or I can leave it to my children for inheritance. And what I told about a lot of low-income people is they don't accumulate wealth. Because if you look around, particularly in Pennsylvania County, there are people who have sort of through deaths and inheritances and smart purchases, who now own 9, 10, 11 buildings, houses. And they can rent them, or they can use them for sales, for other forms of income. But if you are left out of that, then that's not an option for you. And I'll to point out what I'm talking about here, there's a fellow who wrote a book, and this will take y'all all the way back to the name of this fellow is going to take you all the way back to period 1, and his name is Hernando de Soto. And he's not to be confused with the guy who explored the Mississippi, but this is what De Soto wrote. Whoops, excuse me there. And I wanted to show you all this book because it's a great book. I have a copy of it, but what he highlighted is why capitalism works in the West and fails everywhere else. And he argues, and I think accurately, if you're in Latin America, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, most people don't own property. And so you have like the latifundia in Latin America. Well, in many ways, the inner city of the 1970s was like a third world country. They didn't have access to capital. And so they had the mystery of capital. Whoops, didn't mean to erase all that. So the mystery of capital means that you don't get to pass assets down to your children. And wealth doesn't in any way accumulate. So that's why the poor stays poor. And why the rich gets richer is because they're able to use their money to make more money. They don't have to have a job. They can just let their money earn money, so to speak. We call that capital gains. I've already taught you about redlining, which is the idea of the federal government literally saying, you can't have money, black people, to live in these areas. And that's an obvious thing. And then here's another thing that actually emerged during this period as well. It's called a contract by deed, or contract for deed. And what this means is you sign a contract to live in a house. You pay monthly installments, just like rent, and you did not actually get to take control of the house. The quote buyer had to do everything, repairs, taxes. The seller kept the title until the final payment was made. But if you even missed one payment, they could evict you. And so what will normally happen is you would have white landlords. And I'll be honest, critics of the Trump family, Trump's father, blame, say he's responsible for this kind of behavior in New York City. This is the senior Trump. But you can see here, real estate exploitation creates ghettos. And that's the idea, is that sort of like people who own these properties aren't the people who live in them. And thus, they're not as concerned about the quality of life there. So the sort of major topic post-Voting Rights Act is the need for housing reform. And what's going to happen, and you really should be aware of this, is an explosion of urban unrest. Okay, urban unrest. And by that, I mean race riots. Now, the word race riot sort of sounds like a riot between races, and that's not always the case. These are, in many ways, tragically, vandalism of people's own neighborhoods. But keep in mind, it's not really your own neighborhood if you don't own the building, right? If you don't own the property. So what you would see here is a lot of factors. I would put at the top of the list economic inequality. So always the cause of violent struggles throughout history is when the poor have so much less than everybody else. And so economic inequality, major factor. A lack of housing that they could afford to own. These urban renewal projects usually were gentrification. Do you guys know that word? Are you familiar with gentrification? So urban renewal is kind of a nice word for what is sometimes called gentrification, okay? So I didn't mean to click on meme there, and got a lot of funny memes. But gentrification kind of goes like this. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's a good looking thing there. So, although it doesn't look identical, does it? I'm looking for one that your eyes can make. Oh, that's easily one. Okay, so here's an example of gentrification right here. I'll show you. Yeah, right. So gentrification looks like this. Same building, right? And you can see it's a Jewish deli on 2nd Avenue. And notice that the signs are beat up, kinda, and it just doesn't look that nice. And now what's in it is a Chase Manhattan Bank, right? Let me see if there's some better ones here. Okay, this one looks pretty good. So the idea is you take a rundown neighborhood, okay? Here, that one's even better, isn't it? Yeah, these are boarded and shuttered up, right? So you take a neighborhood where it's too expensive already for people to live in. See how these windows are boarded up, and there's no businesses or anything in them. They're just kind of run down. And that was going on all across New York, right? And then someone clearly has come in and invested money in it. Now, there's nothing wrong with community development, but the problem is people actually lived in these. They didn't own them, they just lived in them. Right? They rented them, and it was terrible and run down. And then when people bought them like this, then the price went up to live there, and they couldn't live there anymore. So once the community got nice, the Black people were pushed out. That's gentrification, okay? So I'd be familiar with that concept as well. Just the idea that, and try to think about, and a lot of times urban renewal is great. If you think about downtown Danville in the warehouse district, nobody was living there. There were empty warehouses, right? But if you went over like 4 blocks to Green Street and then just said, okay, we're gonna buy up all the houses on Green Street, and then we're gonna start charging double the rent, then that would push people out, right? And then you could renovate the housing and white people would move in. And so that kind of thing definitely happened a lot. The other major factor of this was what was perceived at the time, of course, as police brutality. And police brutality, if you think there's an issue with it now, flashback 50 years ago, okay? And there was a whole lot more of I can't breathe back then. And it was very little regulation of it at all to speak of. So that coupled with the rise of militant African Americans, meaning, Dr. King was not militant. Everybody understand that? Like, he was not by any means adversarial to the point of violence. He was nonviolent, conflict, if you want to call it that. Yes, exactly, like a pacifist. But there were going to be leaders who emerged who were absolutely not pacifists. So what you're going to have is just 100 plus race riots, and by that I mean African American riots in their communities, and over these issues. So let's take a look at the two most famous groups or leaders of Black militancy. So the first comes out of the Nation of Islam. So I'd like you to know the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslims, they're sometimes called. So the Nation of Islam was founded by the Prophet Elijah Muhammad. So this is Elijah Muhammad. I'll show you him sitting with probably one of his most famous converts. So here's Elijah Muhammad right here. And here's perhaps his most famous convert to Islam, Cassius Clay, who became, as everyone knows, Muhammad Ali during the 60s. So this was the Olympic champion boxer from Louisville, Kentucky. And this religious group were called the Black Muslims. And they had their whole code of beliefs, much connected to the Quran and Islam teaching, but also towards what we would call Black separatism. So Black separatism, if you go back to like Marcus Garvey, is the idea that white people are incapable of coexisting peacefully with Black people. And Malcolm X, for example, is going to routinely call white people the white devils, in his sermons and his speeches. Malcolm X was Malcolm Little by birth, and he was in prison when Elijah Muhammad came and preached to him, and he converted. And so he rejected his white slave name, he said, his family name, and converted to Malcolm X. And so I've got some of his most famous quotes up here. We won't organize any Black man to be a Democrat or Republican because both of them have sold us out. Both parties have sold us out. Both parties are racist, and the Democratic Party is more racist than the Republicans. And then here's him kind of making fun of the Montgomery bus boycott. Having the opportunity to ride on the front, the back, or the middle of someone else's bus doesn't dignify you. When you have your own bus, then you'll have dignity. So, his idea was, if someone messes with you, fight back. If somebody puts their hand on you, it's like he says right here, be peaceful, courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. But that's not Martin Luther King's speech, right? That's absolutely the opposite of what Martin Luther King would have said. And, he would make fun of Dr. King. They actually had a conversation on TV together, the two of them. And while they may have wanted similar goals in the long term, they were very, very different in attitudes. So it kind of reminds me of like the Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois rivalry, right? In a sense that there were different approaches to this. This movement mostly has its success in Harlem. I would point that out. So this is also where Malcolm X will be assassinated, is in Harlem. So what's going to happen is Malcolm X is going to, be around the country preaching his message of, power, empower yourself, Black power, empowerment, and resist any kind of white racism, so to speak. And then he is going to fly to Mecca. He's going to go on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And while he's in Mecca, he's going to meet white people who are Muslims and who are not racist at all and not bigoted and don't hurt him or call him names or anything. And if you know anything about the Hajj, the pilgrimage, everybody like dresses the same and acts the same, no matter where you're from. You could be the Sultan of Brunei or a peasant. And so when he returns, he recognizes that Elijah Muhammad has been preaching this Black division too much to him. Like, in other words, he believes he himself has oversold this narrative that white people aren't all white devils and stuff like that. And so he actually modifies his position and starts talking about cooperation. And that's when a group of Black Muslims will shoot him dead in a Harlem church ballroom, in a Harlem ballroom. And so Malcolm X will be murdered, really at the pinnacle of his career, but because he changes his tact. He goes from this sort of angry, militant form of Black power and Black separatism to more kind of like what King had preached about. And he will be murdered for that. I have a picture to show you. He was killed in, I want to say 69. Is that right? He was killed in 65. Sorry, 65. He was killed before King. So here he is after being shot dead. he was brought, and this was a very disturbing event for a lot of Black Muslims, but also a lot of African Americans. I wanted to find his. Well, I don't see his picture. So that's an important thing to take away. Keep in mind also that he was very active with Muhammad Ali, right? Like those two would often travel together. And boy, you're talking about a celebrity pair. Wherever Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali went, lots of people noticed. And so he was effective at particularly converting a large group of African Americans to Black Muslims. But like I said, later on, it's going to produce this sort of terrible backlash. Okay, so know him. And then perhaps even more militant, if you can be more militant, is the Black Panther Party. All right, and so these are the Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party was formed in California, in Oakland. You see two of the more famous leaders of the Black Panther Party. Now, Stokely Carmichael had been a member of SNCC. You guys remember that group, SNCC? But he had evolved from the Student Nonviolent Committee to being willing to be confrontational. And so what the Black Panthers are most known for is they were very much utilizers of the Second Amendment. So what they did is they armed themselves in public, openly. And it's really fascinating. Now, they saw themselves as a community like group. So you have Stokely Carmichael and Huey Newton, and Fred Hampton, who's also a key Black Panther leader, Fred Hampton. But they're going to start a before school breakfast program to feed lots and hundreds of, this is what these are down here. This is Stokely Carmichael standing, Bobby Seale, another key Black Panther, excuse me. These are food bags that are going to be given out to kids in Oakland. So they saw themselves as community activists first and foremost, but they were very, very militant about somebody if anyone messed with them. And that includes cops. They would use an ugly word. They would call policemen pigs. That was common back then. But they said, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he's got the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Racism is not a question of attitude. It's a question of power. That's an interesting point of view. And here he says, Huey Newton, any unarmed people are slaves or are subject to slavery at any given moment. So whenever the Black Panthers would have meetings or travel to places, there would be a dozen or more of them armed with shotguns and fully militarized, so to speak. Here's perhaps the most famous response to the Black Panthers in California. I told you yesterday that the new governor of California was a guy named Ronald Reagan, right? He was the governor of California in the 60s and 70s or 60s, and he pushed through a law called the Mulford Act, which prohibited the public carrying of loaded firearms. So when we think about Republicans being like pro-guns or pro-Second Amendment, the irony is not in California in the 60s, because the last thing they wanted to have is an armed uprising of African Americans, okay? Well, that's true. He was not nearly as pro-Second Amendment as I think people would give him credit for. But regardless, he did sign a gun control bill to not allow for loaded guns to be carried in California. And that was it was pretty much called the Black Panther law, because they were this is a frightening sight to people to see guys in black leather with black berets wearing holding shotguns walking around. That was the kind of stuff that put fear into them. So between these two groups, the Black Muslims and the Black Panthers, you saw a real shift towards confrontational and adversarial, away from what Dr. King had preached. Now, King is still preaching, but they kind of make fun of him. Now, that's this Black militancy. So if you're looking at this characterization that leads to these riots, that's because groups like this are seen as incendiary, okay? And they're going to burn these neighborhoods down in large numbers. And so I'll show you some burning. That's Watts. Watts is a district of Los Angeles, California. It's a part of LA. Here's Oakland on fire, and you can see all the red dots and blue dots up here are, you've got Minneapolis. Think about where, the marches were this past summer. That was back in the 60s. And, they were like, stay out of sight or get shot. So lots and lots of uprising. So I went and looked for some data last night and found some because I was kind of curious to see if there was a way to find out. One of the things I've often heard on TV and others is people ask why rioting happens, like why rioting or looting or things like that. And so I was like, oh, let's see. I gave you a list there just a minute ago, but these are what the black residents who were polled of Boston, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Akron, Dayton, and San Francisco responded. So major cause is the dark blue. That's the major reason. Contributing cause they call the light blue. The combination of both is the percentage out here. So if you look here, the largest answer is Negroes haven't had opportunities with whites to get jobs, high rate of unemployment, bad living conditions, police brutality, and Negroes have had promises that have been broken, right? So those are the five sort of principal reasons. Unemployment and lack of jobs. So routinely throughout American history, if you go back to the Civil Rights March in Washington, it's the march for jobs and freedom, right? So it's this idea that black people can't get work for whatever reason, like because of white discrimination is their argument, okay? But you'll notice here the housing in which they live and the police, right? They're right up there with them. So then they did a same poll amongst white people in those same communities. That's what I was wanting to see is there a difference between white people and black people? So I noticed something. Black people said 78% of the cause of rioting was police brutality, right? White people said 24% of the cause was police brutality. So you see that there's this enormous discrepancy, and you can drive around America and you'll see the thin blue line flags flying, often in some community right beside the Confederate flag, right? And there are a lot of policemen who are upset about the kind of taking of the police symbol and associating it with a racist symbol in their world, in their mind. So interestingly enough, the number one reason why white people believe black people did this because they heard of other riots. Thus, I guess they were copying it. If you look at what black people said, that was possible. Let's see if they have it down here. Hearing of it, 61% versus 77%, right? So, or outsiders stirring up trouble, 43%, up here, 71%. So if you look at the white perspective, someone else motivated them to do it, right? And it definitely wasn't the police, okay? And if you look at the black perspective, it's definitely the conditions we live in, they're saying, and the police. So that's fascinating to me. Now, don't forget that we're in the midst of a political season, and it's President Johnson's season, right? Now, look at what Johnson says. And man, this says so much about President Johnson to me. How is it possible? Now, this is a comment he's making about the Watts riots and the other riots that are going on all across the country. How is it possible that all these people could be so ungrateful to me after I had given them so much? I tried to make it possible for every child of every color to grow up in a nice house, eat a solid breakfast, to attend a decent school, and get a good lasting job. I asked so little in return, just a little thanks, just a little appreciation. That's all. So that sounds sort of like, an irritated, spoiled person to me. Because if you look here, I don't think Lyndon Johnson is considering, what's going on in the society, really. Because this is why they're unhappy. They're not unhappy because they got the Voting Rights Act. They're not unhappy because they got the Civil Rights Act. They're unhappy because it's not enough. They're not remotely close in their world, in their idea, to being equal with white people. Now, I will say both of those laws are great progress, and you definitely should know that. But these are the same reasons, the exact same reasons why we've had massive protests in our country last year. So in 2020, right? So, this is not the kind of stuff that just goes away. And, it's fascinating to me how we cannot seem to get to the point where we come up with a solution to this. Now, I agree with both Booker T. Washington and the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, and that is they wanted Black-owned businesses. They wanted Black communities. That would be a way to kind of restore Black pride, right? The problem is where Black people live, that wasn't possible. So what you're actually going to see by the end of the 70s is more affluent Black people moving to the South. It was one of the most bizarre transitions in history to where more well-to-do Black people are going to move to places like the suburbs of Atlanta. So today, we actually do, for the first time, I think, in really American history, with the exception of maybe like Tulsa in 1921, have the starting of having sort of Black insulated, strong communities, Black businesses, and things like that. But it has really come at an enormous price along the way. And I don't think ultimately, no matter how many laws are passed, it's going to develop without economic development. It has to be economic. Otherwise, guys, the key to not having riots is being in the middle class, right? Like, well, I would go burn down this building, but I got to go to work, or I would march and carry a sign, but I got to go make a kid's soccer game. Like that's the kind of stuff that takes all this stuff away. The problem is for most American history, almost all American history, it hasn't been available to African Americans. Understand? And so that's why Johnson a little peaked, I guess, because he feels like he's done so much for blacks, and he certainly did. But it's not like they're sitting around thinking, well, let's do this to Lyndon Johnson. Any more than I think the protests last year were towards Donald Trump directly. I think they were towards the local community and the problems they had there. But people want to assume that there's a massive Jewish conspiracy that's calling all of it, or whatever. I'm like, all you got to do is go there, and you'll know why these people are upset. So anyway, out of the kind of clear blue sky, the worst imaginable thing happens, and that is Dr. King is assassinated. And he had come up from Atlanta to Memphis to help striking workers. There were workers that he was trying to help, get increased pay, and he had come with the SCLC, and he was standing on the Lorraine. This is April 4th, okay, April 4th, 1868. The band U2 has a song about the death of Martin Luther King, and they say, early morning, April 4th, shot rings out in a Memphis sky. All right, took his life, but they could not take his pride. So the song is called Pride. But Dr. King was here organizing a sort of a lone gunman, I guess you would call him. Let's see, the guy's name was not Ray, James Earl Ray. That's the fellow's name. He was not really put up to, in other words, his assassination was one of the ones that people debated. Was he working for like a larger group? Was he a pawn in their game, so to speak? And the answer is not really. This is one of these guys who was, racist, definitely, like Governor Wallace, but was not in any way sort of like a KKK gunman for hire or anything like that. He just kind of wanted to, be the most famous thing he could do, and that would be to kill Dr. King. He would confess, and then he later recanted his confession, but he died in prison, if the memory serves. So with this, the rioting is going to resume large scale. Okay, it's going to be a national dilemma and a crisis. I'll never forget the first time I saw it in history is when Bobby Kennedy was giving a speech. Bobby Kennedy was giving a speech. He was running for president, Bobby Kennedy was, and he had to stop his speech and say, "I've just been told that Martin Luther King has been murdered." And that was, people were crying, and it was just a really terrible moment because King was the embodiment of all that was decent and good about the civil rights movement. So I want to show you the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, or monument. I should call it memorial. Monument, because I mentioned that it has one of the quotes on it is hewn from the mountain, right? It's cut from the mountain, so to speak. And so it's an absolutely beautiful monument. And if you've never been to DC, it's below the Lincoln Memorial, close across the reflecting pool from the Jefferson Memorial. So here's Dr. King's memorial. Around it, you can see where this family is standing are quotes from him throughout his life for about civil rights in particular. So quite beautiful memorial. That was constructed, when did they build that? In 2011. So that's been fairly new. After King's assassination, there'll be sort of like a generation of people who don't really pay much recognition, but by the 1990s, 80s and 90s, late 80s, there will be a whole host of streets and bridges and places in America named in honor of him, like a tribute to him. So Dr. King, is obviously he's one of the only two people in our, two people in general who have a national holiday named after him, the other being Columbus, so big day there. And we'll talk about that on another event. So I have on here at the end of this narrative, the Civil Rights Trail. And I believe with this map has actually been added. Danville or Chatham has a civil rights heritage site at the Chatham Courthouse. because our courthouse was where one of the old civil rights cases of 1873 took place. We had a white judge who refused to seat black jurors under the old Civil Rights Act, and the Supreme Court told him he had to, and he didn't. So that was kind of an act of nullification even back then. So here you can see Medgar Evers' assassination spot. Just a host of other things as part of the Civil Rights Trail, and certainly a really fun tour to take. You travel down through here. All right, well, we're going to end the civil rights discussion for now. Keep in mind, the narrative of the debate about African-American rights is by no means concluded, but by the 70s, Americans aren't paying much attention anymore. I guess that's the best way to put it. With the death of King, with the death of Malcolm X, it's like we kind of had gotten tired of it, I guess is the best way to put it, we being the majority of Americans. Okay, and there will be other issues that begin to take up our attention. So I've got here a few of President Johnson's foreign policy decisions, and now we're going to shift gears fully to the Vietnam War ultimately. But I do want to throw in here just a little bit that under President Johnson, we're going to send ground troops to the Dominican Republic to install a pro-Western, a pro-American, a non-communist administration there. We also, under LBJ, I didn't type this up or put this in here, but he sends troops to Panama and tells the Panamanians to stay off the canal. Like Panamanians were making, kind of interest towards taking over the canal, and we nipped that in the bud under President Johnson. All right, but most importantly, Vietnam. So I want you to see that, we're going to spend more money in 1 year than in Vietnam than on all the war on poverty at the time. And so remember what I told you about guns and butter, right? You guys remember that term? Guns and butter is where you're paying for both domestic social spending, the Great Society, and warfare, Vietnam. And so those two things combined are enormously inflationary. So on Thursday, when we get to Richard Nixon, that's going to be one of his biggest challenges, is dealing with inflation. That's a product of LBJ's policies, okay? So one last piece of foreign policy news before we hop into Vietnam is number 9 on your guide, but I didn't want to interrupt the Vietnam discussion to go to, Israel. So if you hop down to number 9 for a second, every couple years, Israel would find itself in a war. It had its war for its birthday in 1948. And this war was a combined effort. We already talked about the Suez War, right? Suez Crisis in 57. And this war was one in which the neighboring countries of Israel again attacked in order to try to remove Israel particularly from areas that they weren't supposed to be in. But in general, that's what they thought, or push them all the way into the sea. Well, we're going to provide aid, military assistance to Israel during this, not guys, but monies. And Israel is going to pull off a real surprise win again. So they win in 48, they win in 67, and this is called the 6-Day War. But this is different because at the end of this war, you see all these brown areas that say Gaza, West Bank, Golan, and down here would be the Sinai Peninsula down here. Israel doesn't give it back after this war. So these are territories in which Palestinians live, right? Not Israelis, but Palestinians. But the Palestinians are, A, in their minds, freedom fighters seeking their independence. B, they're refugees in these countries. So a lot of Palestinians flee into Syria and into Jordan and into Egypt. So that means their refugee camps are going to become the base of operations for, I'm going to use the word terrorist activity. So you have this group called the PLO that gets formed, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they're going to start fighting, right? But the reason why Israel takes these things should be pretty obvious. Palestinians live there. It's a really primo real estate that's right up against the Mediterranean. West Bank, all around Jordan, and up against, great territory there. And then the Golan Heights are literally a mountainous area that's above Israel. So if Syria has Golan Heights, they can put artillery on it and shoot down into Israel. So now Israel has Golan, and so they can't do that anymore. Now, eventually, this territory is going to be returned to the Palestinians, but that's in the 1990s. So, for the next 30-some years or 20-some years, this is going to be occupied territory by Israel. And during that period, Israelis are going to move into it. And that's going to be the biggest thorn of contention going forward is you're going to have people that are Israeli living in Gaza or people that are Israeli living in the West Bank. If they give it back to the Palestinians, what will then happen to those Israelis? And so that's kind of one of the big sticking points in the Middle East. But as I told you, the major issue that is going to end up destroying LBJ is Vietnam. And oh, how the mighty will have fallen. So one of the more difficult things about studying Vietnam is what was our objective, right? Well, our objective was to stop South Vietnam from becoming communism, to keep a government and in place. And it's kind of like Afghanistan today, not communist, but we want to keep the democratic government of Afghanistan successful. But there is this thing called the Taliban, which controls 1/3 of the country of Afghanistan, and we're leaving. So our hope is that the government of Afghanistan can resist, the Taliban. The likelihood of it, not very good. So what we were doing in Vietnam was trying to resist North Vietnam from taking them over. So what that meant was, how do you win? Well, it's a tough one. It's a guerrilla war, but it's also a conventional war. So the way our commanders started measuring success was by body counts. They called them kill counts, or how many of the enemy did we kill? Now, normally, if you look at World War II, the way we knew we won is we were in Berlin, right? We had taken over the German territory, or we nuked Japan and they surrendered, and we were in Tokyo when that was over. So how do you win a war against North Vietnam? Well, the obvious answer to some people would be invade North Vietnam and drive out communism, right? Like end communism in North Vietnam. The problem is both with Presidents Eisenhower, President Johnson, President Kennedy, President Johnson, and President Nixon, they all agree that if we attack North Vietnam, like literally like ground troops in North Vietnam to overthrow their government, then that will bring the Chinese into the war, just like it brought the Chinese into the Korean War. You guys remember the Chinese coming across? So, or the Soviets, even worse, So we believe that we have to fight what is called a contained war. Well, we had done it once in Korea, right? Not too well, but we certainly got out evenly. So here's North Vietnam. Now, Laos and Cambodia are independent states at the time. And the problem that is going on is that this, by the way, is the first TV war in history. The very first time when you turned on the TV at night, Walter Cronkite or some important newsman would come on and today in Vietnam, and they would give you some summary. And then at the end of it would scroll the names of every American killed that day or the number of Americans killed that day, depending on if you were local or national news. So like today in Vietnam, 114 Americans wounded, 27 killed. Total deaths, 48. Well, that went on every night. Like every night you turned on the news and there was the body count of Americans dead, right? And so that begins to wear out the American morale. We didn't do this, by the way, in World War II. We didn't be like, hey, after D-Day, 114,000 Americans killed or wounded. That would have really, if there had been cameras on Normandy's beach, Americans might not have wanted World War II to continue, right? Because war is ugly looking. And so you would turn on your TV and you would see an American who was bleeding out, and dying on TV. And and it was graphic and it was terrible, And so a lot of Americans initially recognized, war is bloodshed and casualties. But one of the things that was almost impossible for us because we were fighting a contained war is the North Vietnamese were not fighting a contained war. So what they did is they would utilize the neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia's eastern borders. You see it here? This is the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is kind of like the Appalachian Trail. It's a series of paths and roads, and it's all connected with canopy jungle over it. And so what was happening, and keep in mind, the Vietnamese have been fighting. They fought the French, they fought the Japanese, they fought the Chinese, and now they're fighting the Americans, right? And these people have been fighting for the better part of a century. So they could carry their military supplies, their ammunition, their food on bicycles, on their backs, across rivers and streams. So they were just like literally kind of like, imagine ants coming down a trail, right? And they would be carrying these weapons and supplies. They would get them at Haiphong Harbor or land at Hanoi. They would then march them to the DMZ, the militarized zone, and then cross over the neutral border of Laos, and then come down and then bring the resources into South Vietnam. So almost the entirety of the Vietnam War was fought in South Vietnam. You understand? And so we're trying to liberate South Vietnam, and that's part of the problem. So what Johnson does in 65 is going to change the war forever. So he really does two things. And you should know about these two things. The first thing he does is Operation Rolling Thunder. Okay. And Operation Rolling Thunder is meant to be what it sounds like. These are the heaviest bombers in the American air fleet. And we are dropping hundreds of thousands of pounds of bombs on North Vietnam, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and even places in South Vietnam. Just to give you a sense of perspective, we dropped more bombs in a 4-year period on Vietnam, which is a country a little bit larger than California, right, than in all of World War II combined, including the TNT capability of the atom bombs. So we bombed this country, as Johnson said, into the Stone Age, right? The problem was the Vietnamese already lived in the Stone Age. What could they do? Well, they go get in their tunnels. They go in their caves because that's what they had built for centuries, right? And so bombing them, sustained bombing of them, did not make them give up. They did not quit. They got bombed nonstop for 4 years. And when it was done, Vietnam looked like the surface of the moon, in a lot of places, and it didn't work. So we bombed their capital city, Hanoi. Hanoi would mean, unfortunately, because we were bombing Hanoi, Hanoi was the best defended place. Hanoi is the capital of North Vietnam. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam. All right. And we were bombing so many that we began to lose pilots. So I want to show you one of the people I most respect because of his service to his country. And that's an American war hero named John McCain. John McCain was the son of an admiral. You understand? His father was the admiral of the Pacific Fleet. Here's John McCain in a hospital in Hanoi, in the Hanoi Hilton. I'll put it in this one. They called it the Hanoi Hilton. It was really a brutal, hellacious prisoner camp. But men like John McCain were tortured. They broke his arm so much, damaged it so much, he couldn't raise it in the future. When he ran for president, he would keep a pin in his hand so people wouldn't go to try to shake it because he couldn't raise it anymore. They knew he was an admiral's son, and like it was famous, and so they brutally tortured him. The North Vietnamese did. By the way, John McCain later, as a U.S. senator, would overtly condemn the use of torture by the United States. He says, "I know what torture is like. It doesn't work. You'll tell people anything to get them to stop, except for the truth," right? And so he was tortured repeatedly for years and didn't surrender. These guys would learn to tap out Morse code when reporters came and film them. They would tap Morse code with like their head movements or their eye flip, like that. And that would be to tell their families that they were okay or get a signal to their, and so these guys were prisoners for years. Today, you probably have seen flying on some flagpole somewhere, the POW MIA flag, which, I'm a huge supporter of, because after the war, there are going to be a lot, and I mean a lot, of MIAs who are not returned. And we're going to spend years, including John McCain himself as a senator, is going to spend years going back to Vietnam, trying to, get these folks, either their bodies returned to us as our nation or released if they were still POWs. So that's an example. He was bombing Hanoi. In fact, it was his very first mission. He was a naval pilot. It was his first bombing of Hanoi. And Hanoi had a lot of surface-to-air missiles and air, machine guns. And so we lost a lot of fighters up there. The other thing we're going to adopt is napalm. And this picture will win the Pulitzer Prize. Absolutely terrible picture. So let me show you what napalm is for those of you who don't know. Napalm is a weapon that was a combination of explosive ordnance, okay, So I'll show you what napalm looks like here. So you would have an explosive ordnance that was liquefied or in a jelly state gasoline. So you would hit napalm, a napalm strike would hit, and it would scatter gasoline everywhere. And as the gasoline splattered, it would explode in like a trace of explosion. So you would see it sort of like, this is what it looked like from above. I'll show you. And we're going to use this nonstop against the Vietnamese. So it looked like this. You know, you could see like a row, like the gas would form like a row, and then it would create a sheet of fire. It would pull all the oxygen out of the area. You could breathe this in and it would burn your lungs. This has burnt this little girl's clothes off. That's why she's running naked. Like her clothes got on fire kind of thing. So lots and lots of this to try to hit the enemy. And we had, guys, you know, I didn't teach all this yet, but I need to teach you one of my favorite stories. It's the Battle of Ia Drang, because that happens in 65 as well. Here is the Battle of Ia Drang. Let me give you a map first. So I told you we started doing bombing, right? We're also going to send our very first ground forces initially to defend our air base at Pleiku. Okay, so these are, you know, the idea is that we're trying to defend where our bombers are, because the bombers are coming under attack, right? But pretty quickly we decide we need to get out there and start killing them in what are called search and destroy missions. And so this is the Battle of Ia Drang. If you know the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, you guys familiar with that? Probably not. That's okay. Great movie. It describes and it shows in great detail this terrible battle. So what happens is we send out the 7th Cavalry, which, if you know anything about the 7th Cavalry, well, let's see if anybody knows what the 7th Cavalry is. When was the last time I mentioned the 7th Cavalry in this class? That's all right. It's hard to remember military units, I know. Okay, so this is the 7th Cav. Now, in Vietnam, they reactivated the 7th Cav, because the last time the 7th Cavalry had existed was when George Armstrong Custer decided to march into the Battle of Little Bighorn. You guys remember that thing? He was the commander of the 7th Cavalry, right? So they recreated the 7th Cavalry, only this time the 7th Cavalry would be on helicopters, okay? They would be, instead of riding horses into battle, they would be riding into the 1st Cavalry Division's helicopters as part of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, all right? So here, or division, I should say, excuse me. So this is what it looked like. This is the helicopter war. So they would ride helicopters to the battlefield. And so we got word from some of our scouts that this is the Chupong Massif, a large mountain range, that there was a sizable amount of Vietnamese in force here, right? So we're going to fly 300 guys out here to landing zone X-ray, LZ X-ray. They're going to be going up against about 3,000 guys initially, later even more. And we're going to have an absolutely stunning victory over these guys. Outnumbered over 10 to 1, we are going to fight with the use of combined artillery, airplanes, and reinforced supplies from helicopters, and we're going to hold off an entire battalion. Okay, a couple hundred guys are going to beat back thousands of guys, right? And this will be the first and last major battle that the Vietnamese fight directly against us, because they're going to recognize pretty quickly this wasn't a good idea. Like, you know, we absolutely annihilated them. But to their credit, they learned that fighting us would be an absolutely bad idea this way. So after this almost week-long battle, the North Vietnamese decide, let's not send the NVA directly against the Americans again. That was stupid, you know, because our skill, our tactic, our use of radio, we're going to be calling in artillery and missile strikes within like hundreds of feet of us. You know, I'm talking like from here to the end of the hallway. So it is an absolutely amazing battle. By the way, just as a kind of point of local news or trivia, there was a county native from Tunstall High School, right? and his name was Albert Witcher. So I like to, teach about him whenever I can teach about places. Albert Witcher is going to be killed. Here he is. On the on the first day of combat in the Battle of Ia Drang. So he was a student from our community right here in the Brownsville area, was this young private, and his name is Albert Witcher, and he was killed up here in this wooded area. Okay, so a little bit of our area was right there in the first major battle of the Vietnam War, which we won. We won. But the Vietnamese learned the lesson. All right, we don't want to do this again this way. So there are two major components of 65 you should know. The air war, which is called Operation Rolling Thunder, and the first ground troops in battle. So the actual deployment of forces to fight the war. So he's going to send the entire 7th Cavalry first. I forget how many exact numbers he's going to send in that first year. It says by the end of 1965, there are 184,000 troops there. So 184,000 men are going to arrive in Vietnam initially. So the theory is all right, when we beat these guys back, guess what we did, by the way? We got back on our choppers and left. So it's not a war for territory. And this is one of the reasons why our soldiers got so frustrated. Like, they would sacrifice blood and lose their friends to take a hill because the Vietnamese were on the hill. After they took the hill, the choppers would come and they fly back home, to the base, and then the Vietnamese would retake the hill. So it just seemed to be completely Sisyphean, like you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, it's because we didn't have enough soldiers to control the population of all of Vietnam. See, you guys have to be aware of something here. We're not at war with the South Vietnamese, right? And the enemy could move through and amongst the South Vietnamese people. This is not like fighting for territory like in World War II or even in Korea. We own, so to speak, South Vietnam. So what Johnson's going to say is we have to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. So in other words, who's not really fighting that much? No, the North's fighting a lot. Who's not fighting that much? The South Vietnamese. And that's a problem because, we're there in theory to be helping ARVN, right? The Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The problem is ARVN not that serious about fighting. They don't really want to fight that much. They just want to go wherever the pay is good. So this is what our ultimate enemy is going to be, though. So keep in mind, you had two types of enemy. So I'm going to show you the NVA first so that you don't forget them. The North Vietnamese Army. So the NVA were what you probably would imagine soldiers look like. There. North Vietnam Army. Okay. So these guys and folks look like traditional soldiers. They would have a star on their pith helmets. They would have an AK-47. You can see they're in green uniforms. But we didn't really fight these guys that much. We fought them at Ia Drang, some, but in reality, there weren't that many North Vietnamese Army direct battles with us. And part of the reason for that is that would be, for them, catastrophic, right? Like we are the awesome fighters of that day. So you would see guys often in the kind of famous pith helmet here, and I'll show you this as well. All right, so you can see that yellow star on a red background. That's the communist flag of Vietnam. And there were battles that were fought, particularly near Hue City up north. But by and large, it's not going to be these fellas that we're after as much. It's going to be these fellas. So who are the Viet Cong? Well, they're the civilians, really. By day, you couldn't tell a Viet Cong farmer from a non-Viet Cong farmer. So, that by day he might be working in his farm, and then when you come through, this is what he would do. You understand? So we would often see him, and the kind of saying was in black pajamas. Well, it wasn't black pajamas. It was the sort of peasant clothing of the Vietnamese people. All right. So definitely be familiar with that. Let me shrink this down a little bit. I'll give you a couple more pictures. So the Viet Cong, or they were often called by U.S. forces Victor Charlie, because the call letters VC, or simply Charlie. And these were initially, our behavior towards them was very similar to our behavior towards the Japanese, which was kind of racist. There was this assumption that the Vietnamese were these little, quote, yellow people who would be easy defeated, and we would just annihilate them, right? These were one of the most brutal, strong enemies Americans have ever faced, because they live off of like a handful of rice in the jungle for a month. And, they were real people with real lives, but they would be willing to accept huge casualties in exchange for victory. And so we really underestimated them. And boy, did that prove to be a problem. And they adopted the same model of warfare that Mao had promoted, which is guerrilla warfare. And look at what it says. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. The conventional army loses if it does not win. That sound like anything else you've ever heard? Okay, Middle East. Yeah, sure. Protest there. Middle East terrorists, if you want to call them that. Who else? Or what else? What if I substituted the word guerrilla for patriot and substituted conventional army for British? That's right. The American Revolution. Some people call this war, right, a similar war to the American Revolution. Only instead of guerrilla, we used the mobile army, right? But how did the British lose the American Revolution? They didn't win. And I know that sounds cheesy, but could the British have kept fighting? Sure, they certainly had the military capacity to keep fighting. We're going to have the military capacity to keep fighting in 1974. I mean, there's no doubt we could have kept fighting till now, theoretically. So how then does a guerrilla army or does a small rebel army win? You guys definitely should know this. Say it louder. We get the people in the home country tired of conflict. That's exactly right. And so what Ho Chi Minh will say is, America is an elephant. The American military is the elephant stomping through the jungle, right? But we will be a tiger, and a tiger can take an elephant, because a tiger can get on the back of an elephant and make it tired and wear it down. And so what they're hoping to do is to simply keep killing Americans until America gets tired of sending Americans to die. And that is really a hard thing for people to swallow. If you are fighting a dedicated enemy who will fight until they're annihilated, their only option then is to annihilate them. The problem is, we're fighting for what country? The country that, yeah, right. We can't annihilate South Vietnam. How do you liberate a country by annihilating it, right? Like, well, we killed everybody, let's start over. So this is the problem that we're in. And so Johnson is hoping that somehow we can convince the South Vietnamese people to be enthusiastically supportive of stopping the Vietnam War against the North, right? Hearts and minds. But the problem is we can't tell who the good guys are and the bad guys are, right? So you start seeing terrible mistakes occur. So one of those most famous mistakes is going to take place in Saigon. That is the chief of police of Saigon. Saigon down at the bottom picture. And he will shoot a suspected Viet Cong in the head on national television. And so, Americans watching this are like, that's the good guy's side, right? And we're going to start going through and using a policy called Hamletification, which is we're going to take Vietnamese people by their entire village. Let me see if I can find a graphic of it. We're going to take their entire village and relocate it under into a base. We're going to bring them. Give me pictures of Hamlet. Hamlet policy in Vietnam. If this comes up. Yeah, here we go. So we would take this communities and we would relocate them from their traditional land. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the Vietnamese traditional people, but they've been living in the same community for thousands of years. Like their ancestors are buried here, right? So what we would do is bring them into these places. But, a lot of times Americans weren't very sympathetic. We would kill their water buffaloes or tear up their rice fields. and then we put them in this. Well, that doesn't sound like we're winning, right? The Vietnamese didn't like this. They're like, we don't want to leave our house. We don't leave our village, or, my grandma's buried over there and you're just pulling me out and bulldozing. So this didn't really work, this Hamlet program. It certainly didn't help win hearts and minds in Vietnam. And of course, frequently the Vietnamese people would be caught between the Viet Cong and Americans. So we would march into a village and there would be these massive bowls of rice. And we're like, why do you have enough rice to feed 150 people? And they're like, because we like rice, because we grow rice here. And they're like, we're like, nah, no, you don't. We burn their house down. It's called a Zippo raid, right? So that was another thing we do. And of course, probably the reason they had so much is because the Viet Cong made them. So a Zippo raid would be, we would come into a town where we thought a suspected Viet Cong presence was, and then we would burn it to the ground. Yeah, so that was called a Zippo raid. So this didn't really work either. So none of this was really effectively winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. 65, 66, 67. And then you started seeing in America a tide shift, particularly amongst the youth culture. Now, I certainly don't want to imply that all teenagers and young men and women were part of this, but starting on college campuses, again, that's middle-class kids. Usually these were upper middle-class kids, like at Columbia or at Berkeley. They would start protesting America's war in Vietnam. They protest the Dow Chemical Company for making napalm. They protest the Pentagon. And so you had what became known as teach-ins, where you had college professors who were knowledgeable about what was going on, host a big rally of students and teach to them about what was happening in Vietnam and help organize protests, right? And so the protest movement begins to take off. The demonstrator movement begins to take off, or we might call it the peace movement, right? So be familiar with that. So by 68, there was an enormously strong peace movement. Here you can see lots of people opposing the draft. By the way, by this point, we had reinstated the draft. Now, the draft never really went away. Remember, we had a peacetime draft during the Cold War, and now young people were being drafted, and they were usually poor people from like here, rural communities. They're often Black people from inner cities disproportionately. So it felt like, once again, rich man's war, poor man's fight. For example, one of probably the most famous of all anti-war protesters, well, one of them, one was this guy. I'll put his picture up. And you can better believe that LBJ noticed this. Martin Luther King gave a series of very strong speeches before his death in opposition to the Vietnam War. Okay. And saying that it violated, obviously, the ideas of life that he held dear and cherished. But there was another great protest who got arrested. Well, actually, he didn't get arrested. He got his title struck from him. And I'm not going to say what he said. I'm going to let you read what he said. Okay. Well, I guess I'll let you read what he figure out what he said. So he said right here.
Still working.
No, thank you, Siri. Go away. Here we go. This is probably the most famous protest of all, I think, if I think about in terms of early on. Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted. And
sorry, I missed that.
He got
Could
a
you say it again,
shut
please?
up. Stop talking to me. Stop. Go away. So again, I don't want to read the language that he used, but they asked the champ, and he lost his title. They took away his title. They stripped it from him. They said, why won't you go to Vietnam? Why won't you do that? And he said, I ain't going to quarrel with those Viet Cong. He said, they never called me the N-word, right? And so he didn't like the idea of go killing small little yellow people, so to speak, that were being oppressed by brown people in America who were being oppressed. It didn't make much sense to him that he would support, quote, an imperialist war or a war for, white people. So this was strongly opposed at the time. And we're going to look at some more of the anti-war movement on Thursday. But here was a common chant. People burn their draft cards in public displays. And so, looking over our notes here today, let's go ahead and finish up with number 12 and 13. So these are two elements of the Vietnam War that are political. This is Senator Fulbright. And Senator William Fulbright chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they were highly they were highly skeptical of our long-term goals and objectives. So the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Fulbright Committee, by the way, there's a scholarship named in his honor, the Fulbright Fellows. But he was a senator from Arkansas, and he was really determined to get to the bottom of why we were doing this. He thought it was a bad idea. The other person I want you to know from this section, again, is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And McNamara really was the architect of both the initial plan of Vietnam. Remember, he was President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and President Johnson's. And he was key to the troop buildup. Okay. It was his sort of intellectual concept of how we would. He believed that numbers was the key to the war in Vietnam. Numbers. If we blew up enough bridges, if we disrupted enough supply lines, if we killed enough people, then we would win. So it was like a numbers game. Remember, this guy had been the head of Ford Motor Company. He was like a math whiz, right? And so for him, war was a mathematic calculus. You understand? Well, that's his biography or his memoir. I read that in college. Look at what it says. The tragedy and lessons of Vietnam. McNamara is going to say in his memoir, it was a terrible mistake, right? And a lot of people in America then, I mean, like, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, I guess now, were upset at him, But, I think he was right that he was wrong. He was wrong the first time. And we kind of learned the lesson of it the really hard way. And it seems today that we still don't understand the lesson of it. We've spent 20 years in Afghanistan. And when we leave this year, it's the exact same way it was after 2 years. We could have just left after 2 years and been in the same place 18 years later, So that's kind of where we are, like, why are we fighting wars of occupation? Because they don't work. We know that as a lesson of history. Unless you nuke countries out of existence, they're going to keep fighting. That's their nature. And then the other thing, and here's where LBJ gets a pass because everybody focuses on Nixon, and they shouldn't. LBJ turns into kind of a scumbag by the end of his presidency. He was always an interesting guy, and for him, it was always about power just as much as he was both that and getting effective. But during the anti-war movement, starting about '67, he takes the FBI and the CIA aside, the directors, and orders them to start spying on the American people, particularly the anti-war movement. Now, we know this with Nixon because he had what was called the enemies list, which is a list of Americans he considered enemies. But the first operation is called Operation Chaos. This was the CIA sowing false information, particularly amongst civil rights people. Like fake news. They would make up fake news. Now, by the way, the CIA has no authority at all to operate within the United States. CIA is not supposed to be spying on Americans or infiltrating American groups. And they did it. That's right. And so they prepared dozens of reports that at the end of the day, by the way, at the end of the day, they found there was no connection to any of these American anti-war movements and communism or anti-war movements and foreign actors. So what LBJ wanted was dirt on these anti-war groups and didn't get any. So then he tasked the FBI to go after the same groups. And here's who the FBI went after. Now, I reminded you J. Edgar Hoover was serious about capturing communists, but could care less about civil rights, right? And the groups that he most frequently spied on was Dr. King, the AIM movement of the American Indians, Black Panthers, women's liberation leaders, the SDS. So he spies on FBI, runs a program called COINTELPRO. You see it there? It is very infamous today because it's basically the FBI trying to dig up dirt on American citizens who have not done any criminal activity and then trying to connect that to, well, communism, right? So Martin Luther King will be called a communist routinely during this period. And Hoover, the Justice Department is supposed to be helping guys like Dr. King, not, looking out for dirt on him. This is the guys that recorded King having an adulterous affair and sent it to his wife, right? So that's not really what we expect our government to be doing, I hope. So anyway, be familiar with COINTELPRO, which is as close as America, I think, seriously has ever come to using a secret police force. Now you're not killing people or disappearing people, thank goodness. But when you have a legitimate arm of the executive branch, the FBI, being used for, attacking American civilians, That's awful. So I think, you know, LBJ really kind of let us down with this and with the FBI. Meanwhile, we have a 4-star general in charge named Westmoreland. He was called Westy, at the time. You should probably know General Westmoreland. He looked the part of the general, but he is going to make the serious error of believing that if we just get more troops, then that will be the light at the end of the tunnel. Like if we keep sending more and more troops, and we call this escalation. So on Thursday, we'll pick up with the end of, all of this and Richard Nixon. Okay. Please don't forget to message me if you want your DBQ at a different time than class time. All right. So everybody, I'll stay on for a minute as soon as I stop recording to see if anybody has any questions.